A spokesman for number 10 Downing Street has, in the last few minutes, said that the Prime Minister, who's in intensive care for coronavirus at St Thomas's Hospital in London, has been stable overnight and remains in good spirits. The spokesman said that Boris Johnson is receiving standard oxygen treatment and is breathing without any other assistance. He hasn't required mechanical ventilation and does not have pneumonia. The Prime Minister was admitted to hospital on Sunday night after persistent coronavirus symptoms over several days, which worsened. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has been asked to deputise for him. Messages have come in from leaders across the world wishing the Prime Minister well. This morning, it emerged that Michael Gove is also now self-isolating as a member of his family is displaying symptoms of the virus. Our first report this lunchtime is by our political correspondent, Nick Eardley.
Westminster and the country wait. Across the Thames from the Houses of Parliament, the Prime Minister remains in intensive care, struggling to overcome coronavirus. Boris Johnson has shown persistent symptoms since testing positive 12 days ago.
I still have one of the symptoms, a minor symptom of I still have a temperature, and so...
These pictures from Friday were the last time we saw him from self-isolation in Downing Street, but his condition has got worse.
He was taken into intensive care at 7 o'clock last night after his condition worsened during the day. As we speak, the Prime Minister is in intensive care, being looked after by his medical team, receiving the very, very best care from the team at St Thomas's. And our hopes and prayers are with him and with his family.
This afternoon, Downing Street has said the Prime Minister remains stable and in good spirits overnight. He is receiving oxygen treatment, but otherwise breathing unassisted. His spokesman said that he hasn't required the use of a ventilator and hasn't been diagnosed with pneumonia. The Foreign Secretary has been asked to deputise for the Prime Minister. He's in very good hands, Dominic Raab said this morning, arriving for the daily meeting with ministers and government advisers to discuss the coronavirus strategy.
The Prime Minister's designated Dominic, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, as First Secretary of State. That means that Dominic takes on the responsibilities of chairing the various meetings that the Prime Minister would have chaired. But we're all working together to implement the plan that the Prime Minister set out in order.
Shortly after this interview, Michael Gove confirmed he was self-isolating after a family member showed symptoms. This virus is impacting the very top of government at a time of unprecedented challenge. For now, normal political life is on hold.
People are clearly anxious. I know the business of government will continue. I was in touch with the Foreign Secretary last night, and I want to say that the Labour Party will act in the national interest. And that's why I've offered to act constructively with the government and support them where that's the right thing to do and push them further where we need to do it.
I want to send every good wish to him, to his fiancée and to his whole family. We are all willing you on, Boris. Get well soon.
One of Mr Johnson's predecessors had this message.
All of us are praying for Boris and thinking of him and praying and thinking of his family and hoping that he gets well soon and gets back to number 10, where I know he wants to be and where we all want him to be. Boris is a very tough, very resilient, very fit person. I know that from facing him on the tennis court, and I'm sure he'll come through this.
Friends of the Prime Minister say he's a fighter.
You know, he's a pretty fit guy, Boris. He may not look that fit. He's got a heavy frame. He played a lot of rugby at school. You know, he's a fairly big guy, but, you know, he plays tennis very well to a high standard. He runs regularly. And I think if anyone's got a chance of beating this, then Boris Johnson's got a chance of doing that.
An unprecedented health emergency for the country, an unprecedented situation in government, and an uncertain road ahead. Nick Eardley, BBC News, Westminster.
As we heard, Downing Street says the Prime Minister has been receiving standard oxygen treatment in an intensive care unit at St Thomas's Hospital, but he hasn't required mechanical ventilation. An ICU ward provides treatment and close monitoring for patients who are too seriously ill to be cared for in other parts of the hospital. Here's our health correspondent, Richard Galpin.
Intensive care units are where severely ill patients are brought, their lives potentially at risk. The Prime Minister was taken into an intensive care unit like this one yesterday after his condition deteriorated. He was conscious, given oxygen via a mask, but not put on a mechanical ventilator, a more intrusive procedure. But most patients do need ventilation quite soon. So what's it like to be on a ventilator, which takes over the breathing process?
To be able to cope with that breathing machine, one needs to be very heavily sedated and usually given a paralysing agent, a bit like curare, that stops the muscles working so the breathing machine can do its work. The patients are often nursed lying flat in a rotation between lying flat on their tummy and on their backs in a roughly 16-hour cycle.
The doctors and nurses working in these intensive care units are constantly checking their patients.
In normal times, you might expect that your blood pressure, your heart rate, your breathing rate would be recorded probably once every few hours, perhaps slightly more frequently if they're quite unwell. In intensive care, we do it continuously, and there's a monitor by the nurses' station that can be monitored all the time, even when a nurse isn't at the bedside. So we can keep a much closer eye on people. Mr. Johnson may also have a special needle into one of his arteries that allows us to take blood samples that can very accurately monitor his blood oxygen levels.
Going through intensive care is, of course, a very difficult experience. Getting out of hospital is a huge relief.
I came out last week on Monday, and I don't know, when I came out, I just felt, I think just coming out of hospital just made me so much better as well, because it was a lonely period whilst I was in there. I had nobody really, and then to be around my family and to just now I try to get out in the garden and get fresh air, and I'm really doing so well now.
Assuming Boris Johnson recovers and is discharged from hospital, how quickly would he be able to return to work?
If this is a short-term thing and he responds well, just needs a little bit of oxygen and recovers over the coming few days, then he will probably be regaining his strength over the next week to 10 days.
Downing Street says Boris Johnson is not on a ventilator at the moment, but he is getting oxygen using a mask. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
In a moment, we'll hear from our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young. But first, Charlotte Gallagher is outside St Thomas's Hospital, where the Prime Minister is being treated. And Charlotte, just give us the latest on the Prime Minister's condition.
Boris Johnson remains in intensive care this lunchtime, but we've had an update in the last 10 minutes from Downing Street. They say he's in a stable condition, he's in good spirits, he is being given oxygen, but crucially he is not on a ventilator. Part of the reason he was moved into intensive care was so he could be near a ventilator if he needed one. Now the hospital looks a bit different, as you can probably tell. There's police at every exit and entrance. Security hoarding has gone up around the hospital, highlighting the dramatic and unusual situation we're in at this moment. Worrying time, obviously, for Boris Johnson's friends and family. His partner is pregnant. And one of the cruelest things about coronavirus is that when you're being treated in hospital, your family and friends can't come and see you because the virus is just so infectious. Now, Nadine Dorries, a health minister who herself had coronavirus, she spoke to Boris Johnson a few days ago, and she's told the BBC that he's a fighter, but was annoyed that he couldn't quite bounce back as quickly as he'd hoped. And she said he was concerned for all the other people that are struggling with coronavirus as well.
And Vicky, how is the government functioning without Boris Johnson at the helm?
Well, the Prime Minister's official spokesman is saying that the government is very determined to carry on fighting this coronavirus and making the point that there is a clear plan that's been set out by the Prime Minister, and every cabinet minister, every department in Whitehall knows what they need to be doing. Now, as we know, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, is designated as the person who stands in for the Prime Minister. They're very clear that the Prime Minister remains the Prime Minister. Dominic Raab's role this morning, for example, was to chair that daily War Cabinet, it's become known as, the meeting which talks about the response to coronavirus. There are also several other committees made up of ministers, each working on their separate area. And of course, the role of the Cabinet Secretary, the most senior civil servant in Whitehall, will be incredibly important. But they are having to make certain decisions. For example, that weekly audience between the Queen and the Prime Minister. They've decided they're not going to hold that while the Prime Minister, of course, is in hospital. But officials will keep in touch with each other. But there's no doubt that these are not normal times. The Prime Minister remaining, of course, in intensive care.
Vicky, thank you. Vicky Young there in Downing Street, and thank you too to Charlotte Gallagher outside St Thomas's Hospital.